If you're anything like me, you have a ton of scraps. I have so many scraps. So many scraps, it's crazy. And as part of my massive scrap collection, I have this bin, and this is just a small part, by the way, but this is a bin of 2.5-inch squares. So let me just tell you how I got started collecting 2.5-inch squares for scrap quilts. Back in 1999-ish, 1998, 99, we were all collecting charms. And back then we called charms the 2.5-inch squares. And we were doing this because we were all making millennial quilts. I hope some of you out there remember this. There were Yahoo groups and we'd swap fabrics. They'd cut up a whole bunch of 2.5-inch squares and just swap them all over the United States and all over the world, actually. And you'd collect these into groups. And one of the most popular patterns that were being used at that time was this one right here, to sew these all together. This has become my absolute favorite scrap quilt or scrap buster quilt block. But before we get started on this tutorial, my name is Chris O'Neill from Sew the Distance. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Okay, so each of these blocks is made up of 2.5-inch squares. And for each of the large blocks, you are going to need, I'll move this out of the way so you can see, you're going to need 18 2.5-inch square dark fabrics, 12 2.5-inch square light fabrics, and 8 half square triangles that are made up of lights and darks. And if you're unsure if a fabric is light or dark, you can always use what's called a ruby beholder, which is like this red piece of, I don't know, mylar plastic or something, and put over the fabrics, and it'll allow you to see the value of the fabrics. Let's see if I can get that in the camera. So if I put this over top of these, you can see how there's lights and darks, and that really allows you to see the value. A really great tool that you can purchase usually at a quilt shop or online, or even I think at film shops and stuff like that. You can get these. You can also use your phone, take a picture and change it to black and white, and that'll also give you an idea of the value of the fabric. So it's really important to have that, just because it does make the block and gives you this line. You can use some mediums in there mixed in, but use them sparingly so you get this overall look. I also use a variety of different fabrics. I really don't care about what's on them necessarily. So if there's novelty prints or holiday prints, that's fine with me. I'll mix them in with anything. My only rule is that I don't put the same fabric next to each other. Before we get started talking about the block and how to construct it, I just want to warn you that throughout this video there's going to be a few times where I kind of break the quilting rules. Tell you what, I'll give you a warning of when I'm going to break the rules. I'll put it up on the screen so you can see, and you can look away if it really bothers you. I know some people get really bothered by the rules being broken. I personally just want to make it as fun and easy as possible, so I break the rules. Okay, let's talk about the block. So this block is made up of 4 quadrants, and each of these quadrants is made up of 7 2.5-inch squares and 2 half square triangles that measure 2.5 inches. Okay, so let me show you what I'm talking about, make it a little more clear. Each is made up of 4 of these quadrants. I'll show you how it's put together. Okay, so this is how it's put together to give us this really cool look when it's all sewn together. So we're going to start by learning to make just this quadrant. Now this is basically a half square triangle, so you can move these around and get different configurations, just like you can with the log cabin block, but I really love this one. I think it gives you a really cool secondary pattern, and it just, I don't know, looks really scrappy and fun. So when picking the fabrics, I keep this extremely scrappy. Let me reach over here and get my bin. I have a bin here of 2.5-inch squares. When I'm cutting up scraps, I'll throw them in here. I have some that are really, really old. People have given me some. So I have a bunch in here. When it gets really full, I start making these blocks and it helps just keep down the sheer amount of these 2.5-inch squares that I have. I also have this container, which has a whole bunch of half square triangles in it. When I'm finished with a project and I have extras, I'll throw them in here. And then I can pull from this for this project or any other project that I might need half square triangles for, and I can resize them. I realize that you might not have all these scraps, and there are some really wonderful tools out there to cut your 2.5-inch squares. I highly recommend a 2.5-inch ruler to cut them. You can also use jelly roll strips, leftover jelly roll strips. Those are 2.5 inches too. or you can use your AccuQuilt if you have one. There's a wonderful die that you can cut 9 at a time, which is a lot of fun too for scrap busting. And for the half square triangles, if you don't have the block lock ruler, you can make your own. You can see I just put some tape here. That gives you the same results. You just put this onto that seam, and then you can trim them up to 2.5 inches. And there's many different ways of making half square triangles. You can use those papers that come on a roll. You could do the 2 at a time method, where you take 2 pieces of fabric, and for 2.5 inch squares, you'd use 3 inch squares to make them. You draw a line down the middle and then sew a 1/4 inch on each side of that line and cut them apart, press them, and open them up, and you'll have a half square triangle. And then all you have to do is square it up. So here is our block. I'll show you how it's put together. I don't care if browns are next to oranges or blues or whatever it might be. I think it's a true scrap quilt in that sense. The only thing I won't do is I won't put 2 squares together that are exactly the same. And I'm doing this wrong. That goes there like that. And this goes here like that. So what I do is I sew each row together, and then I sew those rows to each other. Let me show you what I mean. So I have this row, and this row. Let me move these out of the way so we can get a better look at these. Okay. The one thing I want you to notice is these 2 units are not the same. So the top row has a half square triangle with the dark here, then the dark, dark, and the bottom row has a half square triangle with the light here, light, light. Okay, so notice how even these half square triangles are turned differently. You can get really mixed up because sometimes you get into a zone where you're chain piecing, and you want to make sure you pay attention to this. And then this gets flipped right here. Now, here's one of the spots where I break the rules. Technically, with a scrap block like this, you should open your seams to reduce bulk. But I personally really like when the seams nest together, meaning that they kind of go together and lock into place. Hopefully you can see that. And they kind of just are happy. One's going one way, one's going the other. I also don't like pressing my seams so there's bulk with a half square triangle. So the top row I press in, the middle row I press out, and the last row I press in. That way it locks together. The only issue with this is when you go to put these units together, you may have to fuss with some of the seams and push them in different directions and all that wonderful stuff. So be aware of that. That can be a pain, but for me, it's worth it for the ease of construction because I really like to have a nice sharp points here, and it will make a lot more sense when we get to the next step. So once I have these 3 together, I sew this to this, open it up, press it, and sew this to this, and I have my block. Almost. So let me set these aside and I'll show you what I mean. Again, here's another spot where I break the rules. The block itself should measure 6.5 inches by 6.5 inches. In my experience with making this block, that never happens, okay? It always is wonky. In fact, you can even see how this block is a little wonky. These are all scraps, so I don't know for sure where the straight of grain is. I don't know exactly how they were cut when I cut them up to put them in the bin. If people gave them to me, I don't know if they were cut on the diagonal. I just don't know. And there's a lot of seams that come together. Even if you have the perfect 1/4 inch, you can still have some bulk and some really wonkiness to these. So what I do is, and again, look away if this is gonna really bother you. It's really the greatest trick ever. But what I do is I cut these down to 6-inch squares instead of 6.5 inch squares. And to do that, I use my 6-inch ruler and I line this up as best as I can with these 2 middle inches here lined up right on that seam on both sides. That's going to ensure that it's centered, and I'm not going to have squares that are real skinny on one side and real long on the other. It's also going to help with my points matching when we put it together. These points, I mean, it's going to help. It's not going to be perfect. That's the only downside, but nobody's going to notice because it's so scrappy. So to cut this down, I line that up as best as I can. And for this cut, okay, for the first one, I don't have to worry about really anything else but making sure it looks square in the middle here and on the edges from here out. So from these lines out, okay? I hold it nice and firm. I cut this side and I cut this side. That is 6 inches wide. Notice I'm not following any lines on my mat. I turned my mat over. It's best to use your ruler to measure anything. This is going to be much more accurate than the lines on your mat, and I don't need them. So for this one, it's a little trickier because I'm lining up this line to make sure it's straight on my straight edge that I just cut, and this line up here to make sure it's straight, and I'm lining up those middles as best as I can. And cut. And now I have a perfect 6 by 6 inch finished block. Now, are these all going to go together perfectly? Am I going to have points that maybe don't match? A little bit. Let me show you on this one. You can see some of my points are a little off, but this one's pretty good actually, pretty good on. That one's okay. But your eye doesn't even see it when you're looking at it as a whole because of those darks and lights. So do not worry about it. It will make your life easier. I promise. If you wait to square it up when you have a giant block that's like 12.5 by 12.5 or whatever it would be, it's going to be a nightmare. Trust me, you're going to have trouble getting it square, and then when you put those together with other blocks, they're not going to be square. It's just going to be a mess. This is the best way to do it for this block. Okay, so once I have all my units put together and trimmed to my 6 by 6, I sew these together. Just like that. Another tip that you can do is if you have a fabric that maybe is a medium, like this fabric here, you can turn it over. So notice this is the front of the fabric. Okay, I flipped it over and I used the back side. Don't be afraid to do that with your scrap quilts. Nobody's going to know. And sometimes that just extends the scraps that you have because you have both sides if you want to use them. Isn't this a great block? I think you can see why it's one of my favorites. It's a lot of fun to make, and you can use up so many of those really cool fabrics. You could even do it as like an I Spy quilt or something like that. It's a very versatile pattern and a lot of fun to make. I have some more scrap buster videos coming up, and I hope you stay tuned. Please consider subscribing, and after you subscribe, hitting that bell so you're notified when I have a new video. That way you won't miss anything. Have a great day, and make sure you take some time to sew. I'll see you soon. Bye.